Welcome to Shaping the New York City Skyline, the podcast that explores the stories behind the buildings that shape our city. I'm your host, Brenda Slokowski, and I'm here with my co-host,
David Shamshovich.
Hey guys.
Hey Brenda. Hey Camilla.
Hello, everybody.
Welcome back to the studio.
And welcome back to another episode of Shaping the NYC Skyline with your amazing three attorney hosts from Side and Shine.
Woo woo.
We're excited to introduce Zoy Balaskas, who's Senior Vice President and Chief Underwriting Counsel at Commonwealth Land Title Insurance Company. And she was just lovely. I really
learned so much.
Yeah.
So much.
Yeah.
I think this has been the episode that I've learned the most.
She talks about her experience, her background, how she got involved in title, how she got to law school in the first place. She graduated from NYU, got an LLM in international law, topic we didn't really get to touch on too much. Worked a little bit in private practice for a bank, and then went off into the title industry where she's been doing this for about 20 years at this point as an underwriter. And as I say during the episode, and as I've told the audience probably previously, and as well as both of you, which is, when you're working on a transaction, real estate transaction, and you need title, having a person like her, like Zoy, to help and assist and to clear title and to really dig deep, what she calls title forensics.
As we knew about title, and we know a lot about title,
Yes.
considering what we do. As much as we knew about title, she just taught us so much. The intricacies of what she does, and looking at both the macro picture and the finer details to make sure that the transaction works not just now but for the future and what you're intending to do with your purchase. That's a huge deal, and having somebody who's as knowledgeable as Zoy on the deal is really a huge asset. One of the benefits of our podcast is really getting to know the people behind the deals who shape the New York City skyline. I had to set my...
Our Skyliners are going to totally dig Zoy's episode, and if you need any title help, please contact Commonwealth. They're amazing. Zoy is amazing. Obviously, we deal with other title companies. We're very friendly with certain other title companies, and I'm sure we'll have those on in the future. But Zoy's a wealth of knowledge, and I encourage.
You're not going to regret it.
What's that?
You're not going to regret it.
No, you're definitely not going to regret it. I encourage everyone to contact them. And you can do the same for us. We're on the cusp of lots of cool housing changes with 485X, 467M, and also the city of Yes, also 420 extension deadlines, and other things that are coming up. If you have questions, if things are not clear to you, contact us.
Yeah.
We're happy to just talk about it. And if anybody's interested in being on the show,
Let us know.
Yeah, let us know. We're always interested in meeting new people and having new guests, and that's some of our guests appear in that way. And please check us out on social media. Follow us on LinkedIn. Follow us on Instagram. We post teasers and other interesting information. And if you like the show, we'd love you to subscribe on YouTube, subscribe on Apple Podcasts or any other place you get your podcast, and we'd love a review. That would get our message out to more audience members and really promote the show and ourselves and our guests. So thank you very much for Skyliners for supporting us, and please keep doing that. Without further ado, Zoy Balaskas from Commonwealth Title Insurance Company. Hello to our Skyliners, and hello, Brendan, Camilla.
Hey, David. Hey, Camilla.
Hey, guys,
Welcome
we're
back,
back.
guys.
We have an amazing guest, and one that I have wanted on the show for a while, but had not had the chance to approach her. She's the Senior Vice President, Chief Underwriting Counsel of Commonwealth Land Title New York National Commercial Services Operations, which is a total mouthful, and you'll have to break down what that means in comparison to the rest of the groups. Maybe you can school us on that. Before that, you were there. You've been there since 2019, correct? And before that, you served as most recently senior underwriter at First American Title Insurance Company, National Commercial Services, and you worked there for 13 and a half years. You're a Queens gal, born and bred, going to Flushing High School, Queens College, and then NYU. I want to introduce everybody to an amazing person, someone who is really, really smart, knows a lot about what she does. I know this from personal experience. Zoy Balaskas.
Thank you. And it's great to be here.
We're very excited and so appreciative for you joining us here. And tell us a little bit about you. Were one of three girls. You're first generation American. Education for immigrant families, I know this because I come from an immigrant family, is very important. And that seemed to be very, very important to you and your family, and that's kind of what shaped you.
Very much so.
It just shaped her, not the
Shaped her.
skyline.
Right. We come full circle. Yeah, well, my parents immigrated here from Greece in 1969, 1970, about there. Though I found out that my mother had actually visited here earlier, I found a picture of her at the Queen's Fair, 1964. So she was at the famous Queen's Fair. So they immigrated here in 69 or 70, and we lived in downtown Flushing, a few blocks from downtown Flushing. The funny thing is that my mother's entire town pretty much picked up and moved with them. So my whole block for the first 10 or 12 years was basically my mom's village, her town, was in Flushing, New York. You could pretty much get by speaking no English. And when she came here to this country, she couldn't speak a word of English. She didn't have to. She was with people who everybody just spoke Greek, and they just got by. And eventually she taught herself how to learn the language, but it was a very interesting time in New York. So there were three of us, and I didn't really have much direction as far as schooling, other than the goal is to get as much schooling as possible. And I think the reason for that is because my mom, she grew up at a time in a place where you didn't have many options. So she remembers the Second World War. She remembers other wars in her country, other civil wars. So she didn't have that opportunity. So I kind of embraced that, and all three of us kind of felt that it's almost like our obligation to become as educated as possible.
Yeah.
But the direction just wasn't there. So when I say the direction wasn't there, in my mother's time, you were either a priest, a farmer, a teacher, or a doctor. So, or if you were a woman, you could be an assistant to any of one of those things.
Right.
But, other than that, I didn't really know what I was doing. I liked school, and I did very well in it. So I pursued academics to an extreme. I was valedictorian of my high school, which meant, of course, I translated that. When I graduated, I knew that I was going to go to Queens College, because that's what kids of immigrants did. So I did that. I went to Flushing High School, Queens College, and I was actually valedictorian at Queens College also. And from there on, I went to law school.
Did you work or have any opportunities like internships during that period?
The first job I remember in high school, I was actually a tutor in my high school.
I could see that.
Yeah, and I loved teaching. And when I went to college, I actually stumbled on an LSAT prep class. I stumbled on one. And the funny thing is, because I had a few majors, my primary major was philosophy. So I took a lot of logical reasoning classes. I loved math. I was going to major in math, but long story. I liked puzzles. I liked logical reasoning, so I really took to the test. I took to it, and I took the exam, and I did very well. I ended up working for one of the test prep companies for like 7 years on the side. So when I was, in the summer, or if my class workload was light, I would teach and tutor, and I absolutely loved it. I taught every prep class except the MCAT, because I didn't have the science background for the MCAT. And I learned a lot about the education process. You know what I mean? Like the process of getting through high school and getting through college and getting through the graduate school, that whole process, it's so interesting. I took the test. I took the actual class. After I had taken a practice test, I had done well on it, but I wanted to understand why I did well. And it's funny, years later when I started teaching, I had these two students come in who wanted private tutoring. They were both from Yale. They were best friends. And they were scoring back then it was the 170s. So they were in the 99th percentile. And I said to them, why are you taking tutoring? And they said to me something that made me realize what it is to be intelligent. They said to me, it's one thing to do well on the test, and it's another thing to understand why. I'm not sure that I can replicate this if I can't figure out what I'm doing right.
Yeah.
So fair enough. That was a learning point for me to see that sometimes it's not enough to know how to do something, but to sort of pull back and study how you're doing it takes it to a different level.
Yeah, and also every point, once you reach that 170, every point is like a massive lift, because so I think, and the competition is really stiff.
It is, yeah.
And you had a choice, I assume, of law schools to go to, right? But you chose NYU. Is there a reason that was your choice?
Well, I applied to 4 schools, and this is one thing I noticed about myself. I'm very, very practical. I'm practical to the point of it almost hurts me. I'm so practical. I knew I didn't want to leave New York. I applied to 4 schools in New York. I got into the 4, and I picked NYU. It was Hofstra, St. John's, Columbia, and NYU, and any one of them would have been fine. You realize in hindsight, it really doesn't matter.
Right.
It really doesn't matter,
The only thing that it
make
does
that
matter
joke.
is...
They always make that joke of, like, what do you call a doctor who graduated at the bottom of his class?
A
doctor.
That's right.
You know?
Yeah, that's right.
A liability?
One could say so.
Fair enough.
I mean, I think there is something to say about that, because at the same time, there's the opportunities open up more for you if you're in a quote unquote prestigious school. The employers, the firms that you're trying to get into, they're looking at the schools and they're more impressed with those names. So that's where I think
true.
where the advantage
That's
really
true.
lies.
I have to say that that's absolutely true. And I saw that not only in the opportunities when I was in the school, but even beyond. You know, there's something about the name dropping. And unfortunately, that's the world we live in.
Yep.
You know, people buy brand name bags.
Yeah.
You know, because it's the brand. I could see why it's important. Though I always caution people, and I have so much advice for young people, you know, don't get into so much debt, you know, planning your life, because it defeats the purpose, you
Yeah.
know, so you really have to look at it with a balance.
I think it was a smart choice, but you never know when you're going to end up.
You never know.
You have
It's all
no
good.
idea. So then you graduated law school, and you have a position going out. How did you get a job? Your first your first law job.
Well, as undecided as I was in college, that's how undecided I was when I came out of law school. I didn't want to work in a large law firm, so why did I go to NYU? I didn't know what I wanted to do. I didn't know what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. I mean, I really wanted to be a philosopher. That's what I wanted to be, but they don't pay.
And that's the Greek roots, right? in you?
Very much so, yeah. I wanted to, you know, I just wanted to sit under a tree and read Plato and Socrates and talk about it. That's, you know, I want a podcast just to talk about the issues of the day. But, you know,
You still can.
Now you can monetize it, but back then that wasn't a thing. So here we are.
Wait a minute, you can monetize this thing?
Sure, you can.
Sponsored by BetterHelp. It's not sponsored.
So, you know, I got this degree, which is a wonderful degree, and I spent a good 7 years in hindsight jumping around trying to figure it out. And I worked for a mid-sized law firm, which was great.
But real estate was you knew real estate was your focus.
I knew I wanted to do real estate. I knew I wanted to do real estate. And funny enough, all three of us, my three siblings, all ended up in real estate.
Oh, wow.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
What did your two sisters?
My oldest sister, Evangeline, is a real estate broker. My middle sister became an attorney also in construction law, but she left to start a family, so she's at-home mom now.
How did that happen?
Initially, my oldest sister started working in real estate, and then my middle sister started doing that part-time, and that's where the first rumblings of law school started. And then I got influenced by classmates also, and then I had the LSAT score, so I might as well go kind of thing. So it all kind of played into each other.
So you know that you want to do transactional. What are you doing when you first started? Now, you don't want to be at a law firm, but you kind of have to, right? You have to learn the trade a little bit, right?
I started at a mid-sized firm doing real estate and corporate. I worked for a small firm handling residential closings. I went to a private bank working in their high-end residential real estate division for loans across the country. I worked for a startup for a brief time. I worked for a mortgage bank, managing the closing department of a mortgage bank. So I saw the full range of corporation types. I saw the banking side of real estate transactions. I saw the buy-sell side of real estate transactions, and I was at the mortgage bank, a small mortgage bank, when I decided that I was going to try something new. And would you believe that I might have answered an ad in a physical newspaper? This was and I might have even faxed my resume. It's possible. It's possible. It's unbelievable. It might have been an email or a fax, but I responded to an ad I saw in the newspaper.
What was the ad for? What
for
position?
an underwriting counsel at First American. And I had some title clearance experience at that point for my various positions. And I understood real estate transactions inside out. What can go wrong in a closing? Yeah. You see every angle of it. And I had also seen the high end and the low end. I mean, I went in one shop, we were doing mortgages, $30 million mortgages. And on the other hand, we would see these, I won't call them hard money lenders, but people would show up and you would have 20 credit card payoffs, and you're trying to help people to get back on their feet, negotiating settlements with their debtors, with their creditors.
Unbelievable.
So I saw that full range, and I think it was a perfect
But this was all residential, right? You didn't have any. Did you have any commercial experience?
I didn't have any commercial experience at that point, none. And I learned all of that on the job, yeah.
Did you start in your position doing residential, or did you go right they put you right into the commercial?
Straight for commercial. I went straight. They had a training program at that time, and I had a mentor who I sat with for a relatively short period of time. But in those days, this is pre-COVID, we had an open floor. And what that means is that you can imagine the stock market exchange, you're on an open floor and people are screaming. That's how it is. And that's how it is in many shops. And I love that environment. I loved that environment. I used to study in the cafeteria because I needed the background noise. So I was in this open floor with peers, experienced peers, and you can just run up to somebody and ask questions. Everybody was really nice. We became good friends. So it was that kind of environment, except we were trading real estate instead of securities.
You were underwriting real estate.
Yeah, underwriting, yeah, pretty much.
What did your job entail?
Yeah. So the title insurance process actually begins way before the underwriter is involved. It involves land searches, searching land records to derive the source of title, basically, the ownership of real property, and a report is prepared. And in the report, any interests to that property are raised. So you might have mortgages of record, you might have prior owners with interests that haven't been cleared, and basically you produce this report, and it's the job of the underwriter to convert that report into an insurable policy, and a policy that's acceptable for somebody who's buying real estate or maybe somebody who's lending against a piece of real estate. Now that sounds basic, but in order to go from the point of exam all the way to the policy, you really have to understand real estate law. You have to understand trusts and estates. You need to understand a little bit of tax law. You need to understand bankruptcy. There's just so many areas of law that converge in title insurance. Yeah. And the thing is that when you're the underwriter, you're not only just underwriting, you're clearing the past, and you're trying to get your point where your title is going to be, you're at point A, you're going to get it to point B, a different owner, a different lender. You also have to deal with the clients and all the questions that come up. You have to deal with the money. And that's something that a lot of people can't handle. The pressure, the volume of money moving, you're the eyes and ears on everything. You also have to consider things like things that aren't reduced to paper. Fraud. Think about fraud, right? All you can get sometimes are statements from people, and people can lie, right? So you have to have a sixth sense about you, too. You have to have that gut instinct that you develop over time. You have to know to ask the right questions. Google is your friend. Google is your friend. We have tools now that you didn't have before. So
it makes it a little bit easier.
It does, yeah.
But at the same time, these reports that are produced, right? You're searching all these municipalities for violations. You're searching judgments and UCCs and mortgages and other things. How do those searches but then how does the report get prepared? Does a human actually go through all those documents and put that together?
There is actually a human, and that would be called the reader. So it's the reader who generally prepares the report. But oftentimes they consult with the underwriter. So there are times when titles are just very complicated. I mean, some of the puzzles that you see in these back chains are enormous. And if there's litigation involved and other things, we'll get involved in that process. But generally speaking, the reader will prepare the report, and the report will raise all sorts of hairy problems that need to be resolved.
Yeah.
And that's where we come in.
And so how you would go about resolving something?
It depends. It depends. Like a classic example, I've had one situation where you might have a boundary line that's a little bit sketchy. So, for example, you might have overlapping property descriptions. And something like that may involve doing a deep dive in the exam to see where the source of the overlap came, to see who's right, who's wrong, who owns. It may involve requiring somebody to deliver a deed or boundary line agreement to resolve the issue. Or you may have parties who are willing to take a policy with an exception.
Yeah.
That's a classic example of a kind of problem. An easy one is, old mortgages that haven't been satisfied.
Yes.
Those are really lovely because banks go under, people die, things happen. God, one of the worst ones I've ever had to deal with. Sometimes the residential are just horrible. I had one where the file was just sitting around and people just kept passing away, and we were down to 24 heirs. And they couldn't get the property to move because one of the heirs had a judgment, and the judgment was larger than her share of the proceeds, so they couldn't get her to do anything.
You have to know trust and estates too, because if somebody passes away and
Absolutely.
you have to look at the documents, make sure that everything is in order.
Exactly.
Things like that.
Exactly.
Oh, that's tough.
Yeah, you have to consider. What about you have somebody named John Smith, and he's 80. And then you have, the deed years later is from another John Smith, but he couldn't have been the same John Smith because he acquired when he was 60 and the deed came. So there's a lot of forensics. I call it title forensics, which is really a lot of fun.
Oh, I love that.
So you do, I mean, I've probably been on at least 6 or 7 deals with you. You really dive deep and it's not really dirty, but you get your hands papered. I don't know what you're going.
Papered.
You really get into the nitty gritty, and I've had like long conversations with you because for some reason there's always some issue in every deal. It doesn't matter. Like for example, I think in one deal, and I actually don't even recall if this was the Liz pendants filed against the property, but the statute of limitations has already passed, but they still didn't want to provide affirmative assurance for it. What is the difference between omitting something from a policy versus getting affirmative insurance? What is really the difference between those?
Our position is always best to raise an exception and to get affirmative insurance over it. And one of the reasons why it's better is because down the line, people have forgotten what's happened in the past. You're 3 attorneys down, and some title company is going to raise that issue. And suddenly it's going to be a new problem, right? And nobody's going to know how it was addressed. So you could have a marketability issue down the line. As opposed to something that's out there and insured over. I mean, that to us, that's a no-brainer. But for whatever reason, people don't like to see exceptions, and they'd rather get an omit. Mortgages are a classic example. You have an old mortgage, and maybe we have proof that it was paid, but the bank is no longer available, and you're never going to get a SAT. So what do you do in a situation like that? Do you just omit it? I mean, I suppose you can, but isn't it better to raise it and know that it's insured over? I mean, if you enter into a contract with somebody, you're disclosing, look, I know about this, but I'm going to give you coverage.
Yeah.
As opposed to saying, well, we have clean title, and then the buyer's attorney finds it and now wants to kill the deal over it. So we always think that disclosure is best, especially if we're making you whole.
It makes sense to me, right? Because if I have a title issue, the first thing that I do is I go back to see what happened, and I get the prior report to see what happened in prior policy. Mm-hmm. And that's exactly what you're saying to do, because then you have, if the other title company was comfortable with it, they gave affirmative insurance, then this other title company can get comfortable. I assume the First American experience and your experience at Commonwealth, they're similar because they're similar asset classes?
Yeah, very similar. The time period is, of course, different. So I was at First American from 2005 through 2019.
Yeah, so you must have seen some nice stuff, right?
Yeah.
A couple of years after
I
you.
saw great things. I went through a lot, I guess, in those years, because I remember when I started in 2005, it was very busy. I described this open floor, phones ringing off the hook, and then 2008 happened, and the phones went dead. Dead. It was surreal.
Because everything went to hell financially. What kind of deals, if you can recall, what were happening at that time?
I don't remember the types of deals, but I do remember everybody fell off. Yeah. Everybody fell off the earth. And then little by little, things started trickling back. I don't remember it being a big avalanche.
Yeah.
Very different from COVID. This was the most irrational exercise that I've ever seen. The COVID lockdown was completely different than 2008. 2008 was a dead stop, right? With COVID, it was the opposite. What happened with COVID is that, you remember when the city told us, go home?
Yeah.
Right? And we were working like crazy that week. We were working very hard, even afterwards, coming up with creative ways to get the deals done, And the problems we had there were that the clerk's offices were shutting down. That was fun. That was fun. But the deals didn't stop. They slowly stopped, and I think that later on, now we're having the reckoning, right, with the office space. Now we're having a reckoning. Now we're seeing that slowdown in the office market. Yeah. And I noticed it as I was walking uptown. Boy, Midtown is empty.
Yeah. I think this is here to stay. I don't think it's like fully work from home, but, the offices are not the be-all, end-all in New York City. We work a lot with HPD, and HPD, we have to pull title for the client, and municipals is really what they're looking for. They're obviously looking at title, but we couldn't even get copies of things, and there was just this huge backup everywhere. Were you experiencing that same thing?
For the issuance of title insurance, you don't necessarily need the municipal searches, so that impacted the buyers, the lenders more. For us, it was just making sure that we have updated land records. And there were some jurisdictions in particular that were really severely impacted. And in many situations, the industry resorted to indemnities in some cases. But obviously, if you're unable to record in a county, that's a problem. If you're unable to record in a county, that's a problem.
Yeah.
So we took different measures in different times depending upon the facts and what was going on.
Were you having issues
time.
with recording at that time because of people not being in the office?
I'm trying, not so much with not being in the office. I mean, for us, we were able to work remotely. We did pretty well. And most of the clerk's offices actually did manage to get some type of online system where people were working from home. But you definitely noticed a slowdown. I think that obviously now everybody's, back to normal. But there were challenges. I think the biggest challenge was people didn't want to see each other. People didn't want to go to closings. They didn't want to sign in person. I mean, we had people go to people's homes, meet outside in the back.
Wow.
There was a lot of irrational behavior.
You talk about how like the clerk's office has adapted and kind of figured out a way to make it work during COVID. You've been in the industry for so long. I'm curious to know, what are some of the significant changes that you've seen to the industry as a whole that have really positively impacted the industry?
Well, we used to do sit-down closings.
Right.
So New York is very different from other states. In other states, I remember I was working in the California market when I was at the private bank. Everything was done in escrow. They had an escrow department, and you would go to the escrow department, and the buyer would sign documents, and the seller would come and sign documents. They never even had to meet, and the escrow department would close the transaction, and that's how it worked. And that's how many states do things. New York, we were always an attorney state. We're people friendly.
Yeah.
You have a closing, you have the manila folder set up, everybody sits around the table, they order lunch, right? Where the bagels, it was a sit down. And you would send a closer there, and you would have closure. You would literally closure at the closing.
Right.
You would have your documents, you'd have your copies, and you'd have your policy. That's gone. That is gone. It was already gone before COVID, and COVID just put the nail in the coffin.
Yeah.
Now everything is in escrow. When we have a sit-down closing, 10% of the time, we're so happy because you have a closer, you see people. Otherwise, it's just you're in an office, the paper comes to you. Technology has changed this industry for the better and the worse.
Yeah.
I remember when I was interning, so many years ago, during law school, and I was working in a small firm. I think I was working in shipping claims, don't even ask. And they used to get letters. They used to get letters on thick paper. That letter, it would take 3 days to arrive, right? You would have to read it, respond. Now you get an email, and you need to respond immediately. And you have 17 emails that are coming at the same time. So technology has made things better, and it has made things worse.
Yeah.
And I'd say the same about the industry. It's made things better, and it's made things worse. It's somewhat easier to do an escrow closing if you're an attorney. But it's obviously harder for the title insurance company. Right?
Yeah, I mean, the title insurance company is kind of your hero. It's your safety net. Mm-hmm. I always feel comfortable, when I have a good person to work with like yourself. The type of title you're getting is very important. First of all, for the lender. Mm-hmm. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about some of the difficulties or some of the intricacies you've experienced, if you have any examples of these lender policies, which are a little bit different than the owner policies, right? Because lenders have some particularities. They're a little bit different because if they're shelling out $90 million for a construction loan or $20, $30 million for a perm loan, they have specific expectations. They're not willing to accept just anything.
Yeah, and actually, oftentimes coverage that is available for a lender is actually more extensive than for an owner. And part of that is because of just the fact that we're a filed state, so our endorsements are filed, and you're more limited in what you can give to an owner. But also the risk of loss is less for a lender because you really experience a loss if there's a default. Whereas an owner, if you have a fence that's off the record line, the day after closing, you have a claim, right? Whereas with a lender, what's the chances you're going to suffer a loss because a fence is off?
Yeah.
So lenders do want more extensive coverage, but I tend to think that the risk is far less when you're dealing with the lender than when you're dealing with an owner.
What kind of claims have you seen?
I don't really get involved too much in the claims unless there's something that I was involved in. I mean, I know that I had one situation once where the claim wasn't due to us; it was because of a surveyor error, and that was just what it was. And the claim went away when they renovated the property anyway. So there's some things that are completely out of your reach. The two highest, the most common claims are mechanics liens and authority. And what that means is mechanics liens, obviously, you're working on a project, you have cost overruns, the owner is not liquid anymore, and you stop paying people, everybody's going to come out of the woodwork. So those can go sideways easily. And authority has to do with who's authorized to sell the property. How much due diligence can you do? If somebody tells you there's 3 members to an LLC, and they lie, right? And yet, that's where a lot of claims come. I'm surprised that we don't have more. right? If you think about it, because in New York, at least for a lot of these entities, you don't have a public filing of how many shareholders,
Yeah.
how many, and you have these small entities. I credit that to it being an attorney state. You know, you're not dealing with people who are representing themselves, right? You have people who are represented by counsel. Most of the time, you know, they're large names. Even when they're not, they're people who know their clients. So I haven't seen, fortunately, I haven't seen too many problems in that area.
You're taking their word for it. It's not really surprising
No.
because
What's stopping the client to give you a
Yeah.
different operating agreement?
Right, and also I would say not necessarily even from fraud, but a lot of these organizational documents can get very complicated.
Yeah.
You're down 15 tiers, and you find there's a silent member who has authority to,
Yep.
you know,
Right.
he has consent powers.
it's important to have someone like yourself
Ask
look
them
through.
those questions, yeah.
Exactly. That's somebody that's really knowledgeable and understands this stuff.
And the attention to detail is very important.
Yeah.
Very
as well.
important.
Yeah.
And I always say you have to look at the transaction from a distance and at the ground level. It's very difficult to do.
Yeah.
Because you have to understand the big picture, or else you'll miss some issues. But you also have to look at it on a ground level, otherwise you'll miss the details. The devil's in the
Right.
details.
Yeah, they're definitely details, particularly when you have a mix of title issues. So one of the things I want to turn to the title affidavit, which is also an interesting thing to me because it's the same kind of concept where it's like you're just taking their word for it. You know, we don't have any tenants in the property, and yet at the end of the day, they're, I guess, indemnifying you. But if they're selling the property, they're likely liquidating, so they're probably not going to be available. What real purpose does that title affidavit? Is it just kind of a remnant from days of old? Does it really serve any?
Some people generally do like to be honest. If you're notarizing a statement, that statement is admissible in a court, right? So it forces you to, we ask certain questions and it forces you to disclose certain answers. And I've had situations where the title affidavit revealed truths that were important
Yeah.
to know, important to a transaction.
Yeah, because I revise those if there's a tenant and says there aren't tenants to the property. They're revising it saying,
Correct.
except for, you know, so that you know what's actually transpiring.
Right, and you're not going to you're not going to want your client to sign something that's not correct, and they're not going to want to sign it. Sometimes individuals who don't have counsel are pickier. They'll call you and they'll say, you know, I don't feel comfortable signing this, and I'll talk it through, and we'll get to the core of what the issue is. So
Yeah.
I do find them helpful.
And what about surveys? So when you don't have to have a survey, but it's a good idea to have one.
Yes.
So maybe you want to just touch upon why that's a good idea. You know, why the survey is read in, because the survey itself, despite the fact that land records may not show an issue, the survey by itself could show encroachments, easements, and other things that could be problematic. Some of which I've had a problem with, because when you read a survey, you can't necessarily know just by looking at it, at least myself.
No.
You have to go. So how do you do all that research to figure out, well, is this easement something that's a problem? You could spend weeks just on this one issue.
You can. Well, you can buy a property without a survey. And what people don't realize, some people don't realize, I'll explain it here. When you're buying a title policy, we're insuring a piece of land, and we measure that land by dimensions. It's a 40 by 100 lot. We're not insuring that there's a house on it. You know, somebody says, I'm buying the house. No, you're not. You're buying a land 40 feet by 100. If you want to be sure that your house is on it, go get a survey. Because if you're buying upstate, there's no guarantee that what you think you're buying is where you're buying it, right? So one of the purposes of the survey is for the client to figure out if they're buying what they think they're buying. But when we read in a survey, just think of this. A policy without a survey accepts out anything that a survey might show, including the fact that there's no house on it. Right? So when we read it in, what we're interested in knowing is, what does a visual inspection of the property tell us by way of possible other third-party rights to the property? A fence that's offset might tell us that somebody else might be using that area. You might not be able to move the fence. He might be asserting at the very least use of that little corner.
Adverse possessions, like a law school
Right.
hypothetical.
Yeah.
Right. Or maybe the building encroaches onto the street. Maybe it has no impact, but it's something that you should know, and
Yeah.
we're gonna accept that out. There may also be a gate, right? A gate is an indication of a possible right of somebody to come in. Does it swing this way? Does it swing that way? You know, who controls the gate? All these details come into play. So the purpose of the survey reading is we're taking a general exception that covers anything that a survey would show, and we're narrowing it down to cover just what this specific survey shows, and we're just going to point out any offsets, any apparent easements or rights of others, and that's what the purpose of the survey reading is.
And it's all about third parties, right?
It really is all about third parties.
what's the purpose of having? Because the title company or the lender also wants their name. It wants certified under the survey. What's the purpose of that?
I'm sure it has to do with assurances running to the benefit. So if the surveyor makes a mistake, obviously if it's not certified to us, it really doesn't. They're not obligated to us in any way.
So it creates a responsibility.
I'm sure in some ways, and I haven't worked in claims, but that may be an aspect of that. Another point is to make sure that it's a title survey, and that's not sufficient for that. But you can get other types of surveys. You can get topographical surveys. You can get subdivision surveys that don't show the improvements or don't show the offsets. And that's always an interesting conversation when somebody buys a survey that doesn't do anything.
You want a specific survey. What are the other types of surveys?
Somebody might be subdividing a parcel, so they may have a subdivision map done. You can have I call it a title survey on steroids. You can have an alter survey, which has certain requirements that are added onto the title survey. But we typically will see subdivision maps, topographical surveys, boundary surveys. There are times when people just need to delineate create a legal description. But a title survey is going to show improvements, and it's going to show the offsets on the boundary line.
How do you go about and resolve, and what if you don't get an answer?
Here's the secret. You can always find the answer if you have the time.
Yes.
And the question is always a matter of time. And I'll give you two examples. Like, the one example I had a property out on Long Island, and there was a question of whether there was an easement to access the body of water. We were able to do a deep dive, and I actually took a visit to the property. I actually went to the property to see, with my own eyes. And when you saw the visual, you were able to paint the picture, right? And there are other times when it's a much more involved exercise. And I know that sometimes you can't get involved because there's no time, right? The best project I've worked on, the greatest project I've worked on, was a 9-month endeavor involving, I've worked on the Empire State Building, I've worked on the Chrysler Building. The most impressive project I worked on was a vacant piece of land in Dutchess County.
Really?
Dutchess County. It was the site of a power plant that they were going to build, right? So because it was such an intensive construction project, it was very high liability. They wanted to really be sure that they had done the search right. And there were easements affecting the property. There were former train tracks affecting the property. This was crazy. So we did a deep dive back to like 1800s. I mean, there were instruments coming from, foreign governments in the chain of title. Wow. It was interesting. And the most fascinating thing, I did find answers. I had been trying to figure out how the train track played into the property. There was some off-site mining going on, and I was trying to piece together how all that. I needed to understand the history of the project to understand how these easements, who they benefit, and I ended up finding these maps from the 1800s. And because of the train track and the crossroads, I was able to pinpoint exactly where this property was. And you know what I discovered? What we look at as vacant land today, that was happening back then. It was the happening town. It was like the center of their world. It was a big development area. They were mining stone and shipping it down into Midtown Manhattan to build these fancy buildings. I mean, back in the day, that was the place to be. So because of the research I did, it's funny. The research took me to the New York Public Library. There was at one point where I couldn't find the maps because they were so old. So I Googled, and I found out that New York Public Library had them. And apparently they have some secret rooms, and they have like a dungeon. This is a true story. You get permission.
You need special access, right?
You need special access. They give you a handler. Okay, you have somebody walking you through. You handle everything with gloves. They're watching you
like Congress.
Like it's a bank heist. So I actually went that far for this. I went that far for this project, and I was able to piece it all together. With other materials I found online, painted a great story of the whole history of this area. And because I had the 9 months, I was able to really bring that to a close and get comfortable with the title I was insuring. But that's a rare situation. You never get 9 months to work on a project.
That reverts back to you finding the bigger picture and seeing exactly what you're insuring.
You have to, because if you don't understand the big picture, you can't understand the details.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? So, and it's very difficult because you're working at a pace where you're focused on the details. You need to be able to pull back and understand the transaction and understand the land.
Yeah.
Have you ever hit a wall where you're either run out of time or you can't find any evidence that shows that this is insurable? Yeah. And then you just have to say to them, we can't insure this piece of property.
Yes, that has happened. And the only thing I'll say is that if you're trying to buy a property to develop, it's not enough to have insurable title. Because if there's a problem, the problem is there, right? So if somebody's going to challenge you or prevent you from doing what you want to do, my giving you an omit or affirmative insurance isn't going to change the facts.
Yeah.
You might get your money back, but you're not going to be able to build what you want. So I always say that part of title insurance is not just insurance, it's due diligence. So the due diligence aspect is this the right property for you? It might not be. So yeah, I have had that situation.
Yeah, it's knowing what's there and then also what you want to do with that property to make sure that title is sufficient enough for you to do what you want to do.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
And then what kind of guidance do you get as to how much work you can put into this? Because these deep dives are significant, but they're important because that's kind of how else do you resolve these things?
It depends on the project. I mean, there are industry standards, and keeping in mind, when you work in New York City, there's a lot of turnover. So chances are, even within our own family, somebody might have insured the property already. So, we're dealing with, I'm from the Fidelity family of companies. So when you're dealing with properties that have been insured before, there are industry standards. I don't know them off the top of my head, but depending on property type, how far back they need to go, how many insured deeds back you need to go.
Yeah.
But when you're dealing with ground-up construction, for example, the tendency is you're going to be more diligent. And in my situation, we had instruction, go far back because there were easements, there was a lot going on in this particular corner of the world. Quite fascinating.
Yeah.
Is there anybody else that has to be convinced other than you?
We have internal controls. So at certain liability levels, and at certain liability levels, there needs to be more than one. There needs to be, different stages. So we do have internal controls, at every level. But I mean, most of the time, I make my own decisions most of the time. But there are certain things where I myself, if I have an issue that's questionable gray, I'll call a quorum. I will. I believe in the collaboration in this area because, especially if things aren't black and white and they're gray, you don't want to make a mistake. Like I said, it's not just the policy. It's really, are you delivering what people think they're getting? Do you know what I mean? Are you delivering what people think they're getting? And there's a lot of disclosure that comes to mind. If the bank is lending money, you need them to know certain things. And by the way, I found this, but I'm comfortable and I'm going to insure over it. So there's a little bit of that comes into play too. But yeah, we do collaborate quite a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I would imagine you do, and we do as well. But especially if you have something that you feel you want another set of eyes on.
Oh, yeah.
When you've been digging deep,
absolutely,
you're so close to it. You want somebody else to look at it from
that
a
is true.
fresh
Yeah,
perspective.
you get biased. And another thing that I found helps is sleeping on it. Believe it or not, I have found that there's a certain thinking process that happens overnight that you can't tap into during the day. You think of different angles the next day. You think of different angles, and that's why I always am more fearful when I'm in a rush to close. Like, oh, we're closing this tomorrow, and there's a problem. That's more disconcerting. That's more troublesome than if you have a couple of days even to let it marinate, to look at it from different angles.
Yeah.
It makes a big difference.
Yeah.
I think that, when you're asleep, there's scientific evidence about the fact that information gets organized in your brain and while you sleep.
I believe that.
Which is, I think that's why you sleep on it. When you wake up, you can look at it from different angles. I found the same thing when I'm struggling sometimes, not always, but when I wake up in the morning or the next day, I'll have a fresh view on it, or at least a different take on it than I did the day before.
That overnight fresh perspective will say, okay, let's take a step back and figure out the big problem, the big picture. Mm-hmm. Is this a problem for that big picture?
Exactly. That's exactly right.
What would you say, like, to the audience, to people who are listening, who are, real estate practitioners, attorneys, landowners, developers, that something that they should know about title that they don't, and that you want to, I don't know if there's something like that, like, this is something you should really know that probably most people don't know, or mistakes they're making?
I would always say that there's a value in having a third party handling your funds, handling the title. There's just tremendous value in that. So that's the only thing that I would say. But I can't really say that I've been, shell shocked. I also work in a very seasoned industry. The New York real estate industry is very, very commercially savvy. So it could also be that it's the people I work with.
Yeah. I mean, you're working with people who know what they're doing.
They know what they're doing.
And been doing it for a while, and you've absorbed that. I mean, people are probably now looking at you for guidance.
Right.
I assume, is it doing this for 17, 18 years, looks like, if my math.
Maybe 20 at this point.
Yeah.
Is there some part of the industry that
Yeah,
you
18
wish would
years, yeah.
change?
The only thing that I'll say is that COVID did change things a little bit. Not necessarily for the better, but we'll see what happens.
Yeah. Is it because of deal volume being down, or just generally because people are not really in person? You know, less people are in the city.
I think all of the above.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think all of the above. You do feel a difference. You do feel that difference.
Yeah, I think things will evolve and change as time goes on, but I think this kind of period is here to stay for the present. I think people have
Yeah.
to figure out.
Give it 5 years.
Yeah, and I also think that there's going to be a lot of movement. I mean, who knows? But I've been seeing a lot more transactions across New York that I hadn't seen before. A lot of activity in other parts. And, you know, there's been buzz, you know, a lot of buzz in not just the real estate industry, but just in general in business, circling around where do we put our businesses, right? Do you have to be in one location versus
Yeah.
another? You know, can you be in the suburbs? Can you be in these places? I don't know where those places are going to be, but, you know, business will continue. And the question is where and how.
Yeah, I think it's people are just they're going to be everywhere. People are working
Everywhere.
on
Yeah.
and it's in the city, outside the city, and that's what we're experiencing now. Whether that'll stay the same for the next 20, 30 years, I don't know.
Yeah,
But it's definitely here to stay for the next couple of years at least.
for sure.
I wanted to talk about the Tersa rate manual changes. Can you explain to us from a broad stroke? Because I took a look at it quickly. It's like 200 pages, so I don't really know what its purpose is and what are the changes. Why is this change happening?
Generally speaking, the major change is that there are going to be many more endorsements available in New York. As you know, New York is a filed endorsement state, so we can only issue filed endorsements. So they're going to be broadening. It means when you buy a policy, you attach certain endorsements to your policy. And if you ever practice in other states, you'll find that the range of available endorsements is much broader. You have all these different types of endorsements and coverage that you don't have available in New York, at least didn't up until this time. So the workaround up until this time is that in New York, we would give affirmative insurance for certain types of encroachment, certain types of exceptions. So the difference here is that now there's going to be an endorsement for that type of coverage. So the long and short of it is that the customer will have more availability, more options available to them, and the format is going to be a little different. A lot of the coverage that you were already getting, you're not going to get in the form of written affirmative insurance. You'll get it in an endorsement form, and there will be other types of coverage that will be available that aren't available now, and you'll have to stay tuned for that. That's to follow.
exciting. Yeah.
So I have just two quick follow-up questions about that. Does that make it better or worse? And in that context, I mean, what you said earlier, which I thought was great, is that if you're getting affirmative insurance, you can kind of look back at it. This is the issue. We're going to insure over it. We're satisfied. But now you're getting an endorsement. But that endorsement is general. It's not specific, or
No, it can be.
it is?
There are in some contexts it can be specific and relate back to certain exceptions. So the availability of coverage for the options for the customer are not changing. They're not going to be reduced. They're actually going to be broader, I think.
Okay.
Yeah. So you don't lose what you had. It's just delivered in a different format. So instead of delivering it on a silver platter, we'll deliver it on a gold platter.
Oh, okay, fine.
We'll take
I like
it.
gold. Yeah, I like gold better. I think
Gold's better, there you
it's
go.
higher. How do people know about? Because I never know what all the endorsements are available. I'll ask them. What's the menu of endorsements that are available?
Will be all the companies, the industry will be distributing the new rate manual and the more materials to follow.
Yeah.
But of course, we'll always be available, and I'm sure that my phone will be busy. Whether I'm busy with work or not, I'll be busy with questions on the available endorsements.
Yeah, usually say we were like a hotline when 485X came out. It's like a hotline. So we totally understand.
Yeah, and most of the time, especially with lenders, we'll get a request that's much broader than what's available, and we have to whittle it down.
Yeah.
So now, I assume we'll get the same request. It's just that now we'll be able to deliver more.
So a lot of lenders, I assume they don't necessarily practice in New York because they're lending all around the nation. So they don't necessarily know that something in New York is not available.
That's correct. But I mean, we don't really have much pushback there because it's understood that if you're in a filed state, you can't issue something that you're prohibited from issuing. So we don't really have much difficulty there.
Well, I think I've grilled you to the nth degree, and I've learned a lot. And I always learn a lot when I call you and when we try to tackle these issues. I just sit back and listen and wait for you to get back to me with all these documents and then a solution. I'm like, That's great. This is like the greatest
God's
detective.
on this deal.
Yeah, thank you. And not all underwriters are like that. I don't know if you know, because you probably don't work with underwriters since you're it, but a lot of people don't go that extra mile. Exactly. I think you go more than extra mile. I think you go extra 5 miles. And I remember when I first met Art a while ago, and he was singing your praises. Amazing. I'm like, we'll see. And I'm like, Art, she's amazing. Yeah, she's really great at what she does, and that's why I wanted to have you and your wealth of knowledge. Please, everybody, contact Commonwealth if you have any issues, and Zoy Balaskas will put her information in the notes. And if you have anything else to say in closing or something else that you want to talk about, please feel free to wrap up.
It was a pleasure to join you today. I do enjoy title. I enjoy title forensics, as I call it. So, of course, I welcome any calls or any questions from anyone, but it was great to be here. Thanks.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Thank
Thank you
you.
so much for
Zoy.
coming in.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Well, everyone, that's our show. Thanks so much for listening.
And of course, don't forget to subscribe. Also, don't forget to leave comments, because we love to hear from our audience, right, Brenda?
Yeah, feel free to reach out at info@sideandshine.com or visit our website at sideandshine.com. We really look forward to hearing from you.
You could also reach out to David and Brenda at dshamshovich@sideandshine.com and Brenda Slakowski at sideandshine.com.
You want to spell that?
B Slakowski at sideandshine.com.
Those are lengthy last names. You can just find us on our website.
That's right.